Okay, since we're running a little bit late, I'll try to make it fast. Our speaker today is Professor Ian Drake of Montclair State University. He's an associate professor of jurisprudence and teaches courses on various subjects, including the American judiciary, the legal system, United States Supreme Court, constitutional history, contemporary study of law and society, and political theory. He has a PhD in history and has lectured many times in various forums on American history and US elections. As such, today's lecture is certainly as topical as you can get. Professor Drake will speak on presidential politics, the 2020 election. I'm sure he'll discuss the court challenges and the legislature challenges. And I'm pleased to present Professor Ian Drake.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, before I begin, I wanted to note that the slideshow that was presented earlier triggered a memory for me because I'm 50 years old. I was born in 1970, but growing up in North Carolina, I too remember snapping snap peas or green beans with my grandmother and grandfather. So thankfully stuff like that hasn't disappeared completely. So that was interesting that I hadn't thought about that in years. But what I want to do is try to talk about the 2020 elections, plural. I've got a slideshow that I want to kind of narrate my way through, but what I want to do is try to touch on things that are beyond the headlines, stuff that you're familiar with, no doubt through the newspapers and other media, and provoke you to think about some of the issues that I think are important by raising some questions. I've got my own answers, but I'm sure all of you have your own answers as well. And so I know there's a question period near the end. So I hope that these will provoke questions. And what I want to do is share my screen. Bear with me just one moment. Everybody see that all right?
It's fine.
Okay, good. All right. So this is really, when we think about politics today, we gravitate towards the presidential election. And unfortunately, the presidency gets all of the limelight. And in the modern political system, yes, the presidency is very powerful. It's constitutionally set up that way to be powerful, but in some ways, it's far beyond the power that the framers ever envisioned. And I think it's unfortunate that it kind of sucks up all the oxygen in the room because there's so much else that's really important. And of course, this year highlights the importance of some of the other elections. And so what I want to do is talk about the 2020 elections, plural, and talk about some of the questions that they raise. So in regard to the presidential election, we'll talk about it by the numbers. This is one of the highest turnouts we've had in years. Biden had, at last count, over 81 million votes, and Trump over 74. And as you're no doubt aware, these popular votes are the highest totals we have had in quite a long time, with the eligible voting population of roughly 66.7%. And that's the highest percentage of voter participation since 1900, which was at 73.7%. Now, of course, that's not the highest in history. The highest in history is actually 82.6% back in 1876. And the presidential election of 2024, again, it's only 1,414 days away. So we have a lot of time to mull over what these numbers actually mean before we get geared up for the next one. But one question this level of participation raises for me is whether or not this is really a more engaged populace. What is it that causes this higher turnout? And it reminds me of one of the questions that's often asked of PhD students when you're taking your PhD comps or your exams. One of the standard questions for PhDs in history is, when was the US most democratic? And the answer, of course, there's not a single answer. It's a debatable question, but it revolves around your notion of what it means to be democratic. Democratic with a small d, of course. And usually one standard answer is that it was the most democratic when it had the highest voter participation rates. That was in the 19th century. And we see that the voter participation is something that's declined over time. Although voter participation in the 19th century, of course, was mostly male, frequently white male, although for a time during Reconstruction, we had a large number of black males that were voting in the South. But that was one way of measuring it. But there's also another way, which is whether or not the structure of the country has allowed for more democracy. That is, a more inclusive infrastructure for the franchise, for example, after women were able to vote through constitutional amendment. You could put it in the early 20th century, or even in 1971 with the infrastructure with the 26th Amendment, when 18-year-olds were allowed to vote. But of course, that's not actual voter participation. We've seen at the same time that we've been broadening the potential for the franchise, we've seen a relative decline in voter interest. And so in one sense, it's democratic in terms of its potential, but in terms of its actual implementation, it's less democratic. And so this engagement in 2020 prompts me to wonder, what is it that increases these numbers substantially? And I think in some ways it's systemic. One is the effects of the pandemic. Certainly there has been an increase in voting by mail. The turnout was huge because of this. It makes it far more convenient. Obviously, there have been some criticisms of the mail-in voting abilities, whether or not it's susceptible to fraud, and the counting potential in terms of difficulty with tallying the votes. But nevertheless, certainly increases the potential for participation. And that's probably increased it because of the fear that people had about standing in line and encountering others at the polls for the potential for contracting COVID-19. However, I think that it was probably more likely that the participation was in combination with the system-wide vote by mail ability. I think it was also really Donald Trump and his personality. Whether you love him or hate him, doesn't matter, and that's not my point, but rather it shows that our system is very much presidentialized. We give a lot of attention to the presidency, whoever is the occupant of the Oval Office, and in particular, Donald Trump has been a lightning rod for good or ill in American politics over the last 4 to 5 years. And so I think that's really part of what caused this large turnout. It will be interesting to see if it declines in 4 years. I suspect it will decline because, well, again, predictions are fool's errand perhaps these days, because there's been discussion about whether Donald Trump will run again in 2024. Let's put that aside for a moment and let's assume he does not run again in 2024. I suspect that voter turnout will decrease unless there are reasons for people to vote by mail at the increased rates because they fear communicable disease. I think it's going to decrease because this was such a substantial increase over the 2016 participation when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were on the ticket as well. So the voting turnout is interesting to note in terms of the partisan differences. I'm sure you've probably read the op-eds and the discussion, this graph that you see here, the Pew Research Center, detailing the instances of voting by mail, and that would be absentee ballots for people who would have voted absentee anyway, but also the mail-in ballots that some states were mandating. New Jersey in particular, of course, is unique in this regard. And the prevalence of Trump voters versus Biden voters. One big difference is that the Trump voters were a more of a diverse mixture of people who were going to vote in person on election day versus those who were going to vote by mail, whereas the Democratic electorate in terms of voters for Biden in particular, you had a much larger population that was voting by mail. And a lot of speculation on what causes this division. Certainly speculation critical of Republicans who dislike the social distancing mandates or the requirements for mask wearing has been one possible explanation for why they were more intent on getting out to vote on election day itself. But nevertheless, this is a distinction in the electorate, and it was a cause for potential concern about the tallies on election day and the immediate aftermath of the election, because there was a fear that you would have a turnout on November 3rd that would appear to give Trump a victory, while mail-in tallies later would actually increase Biden's percentage and cause a concern publicly that there had been some kind of nefarious activity going on. I think that in reality, this has not occurred, but certainly Donald Trump has exhibited a concern and popularized this through his tweets that in some sense the election was stolen from him because of late tallies that came in for mail-in votes. Actually, some late tallies even for in-person voting in terms of uploading data on servers that would add new electoral district counts late in the evening on November 3rd and 4th. And this has been utilized as a type of evidence that the president wanted to point to in an effort to suggest that there has been some degree of fraud and nefarious action on the part of Democratic poll workers or officials in different states that wanted to take the election from him. Nevertheless, doesn't seem to have been much of a delay, which was fortunate. So we get a reasonably proficient and timely tallying of the mail-in voting, and we get a pretty clear sense, even on election eve, of where the election was going, even though it was in fact close, of course, in several states. So in that sense, I think it was a disaster averted. Now, referring to this question about how democratic the US is, this chart goes all the way back to the first presidential election and covers midterm elections too, those in between the presidential elections when Congress is up. Of course, congressional terms are only 2 years, so we have an election every 2 years in the US. And you see the line here in terms of the early first third of the 19th century. We have the highest participation in both presidential and midterms. Usually, it's interesting to note how substantial the presidential election is over the midterms, as you can see by this graph. But take a look at the 1820s and before. It's the midterms that actually had far more turnout in the first 40 years of the Republic, 30 to 40 years. And it's interesting to note this because you really see how insubstantial in the public's mind the presidency was in the early 19th century. It becomes more substantial over time, of course, and certainly after the Civil War, it is consistently a draw for voters far more than the midterm elections. And this highlights the ascendancy of the presidency. Of course, voter turnout in general for both presidential and congressional declines as the 20th century rolls along. And we see a variety of different inflection points. Certainly in the Great Depression, for example, you see a spike up for both congressional and presidential elections, and it vacillates thereafter. But nevertheless, we see this presidentialized system that I referred to earlier really takes the cake when it comes to turnout, but we haven't seen 80% turnout like we used to in the 19th century. And even with a controversial election like 2016, 2020, we've seen turnout that's been substantial by modern standards, but nothing like it was in the 19th century. Take a look at the 2020 compared to 2016. Even with Donald Trump being one of the most controversial, and of course Hillary Clinton as well being very controversial, even with them being on the ticket, the turnout back in 2016 was 65 million, almost upwards of 66 million for Clinton and 63 million almost for Trump. So substantial increase. And again, we don't know exactly what causes this, but the theory is that it's a combination, of course, of Trump's personality and the infrastructure change in terms of being able to mail in the vote. Now, big comparison that's notable between 2016 and 2020, of course, are the states that switched. You can see just looking at the color coding, forget about the numbers for a minute, just look at the color coding of the maps. This is the modern division, the bi-coastal, as they're referred to, right and left coasts, which are solidly Democratic. But in 2020, we have a handful of states that have switched, which in our electoral system, of course, for the presidency, made all the difference. So those swing states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, were key in 2020. Of course, Georgia and Arizona were all other notable switches. But the real interesting aspect of this, in my mind, is just how pretty solidified this map is, with only a handful of swing states making all the difference. Now, of course, this returns us to one of the perennial questions of late, ever since 2000, which is whether or not we should keep the system, which is the Electoral College system. I want to say a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but you can see here that the Electoral College is really where all of this matters. Biden had a clear victory. It is a majority win with 51% of the vote, not a plurality. And the concern that we have going forward is how strong is the Electoral College system in terms of the public's eye? Is the criticism that's been associated with it since the 2000 election, and again in 2016, when you had in both instances the winner of the national popular vote actually be the loser at the Electoral College, is that going to continue in terms of the angst and concern that people have had about the functioning of the Electoral College system? Will it provoke further efforts at reform? These are ongoing efforts, regardless of the presidential election, but I want to talk about that in greater detail in a few minutes, and hopefully we can discuss it during the question and answer time. But moving beyond 2020 as a particular election, I want to go back to one of the ongoing debates among political scientists and historians. You may recall back in 2004, John Judis and Roy Tajira published their book, The Emerging Democratic Majority. Now, this was an argument. It was a notable one because it was in popular book form to bring the debate out of the academy and allow it to be something that was introduced to the general reader. A debate that's ongoing about whether or not demography is destiny in politics. And it wasn't just for presidential politics, but all levels of electoral politics, from the local up to the national. And Judis and Tajira made arguments based upon trends that were evident over, not just since 2000, but over the last few decades. And at the time, and they've changed a little bit, but by and large, this is still a key question to ask. Does 2020 reflect the argument that these scholars made back in 2004? Now, what was their argument? They contended that an increase in political homogeneity based on residential patterns would start to see itself felt in election results. The rise of suburbia, the decline of the white working class in the United States, in particular with the rise of the service sector, meant a decline in the manufacturing sector, and hence the working class, a rise simultaneous and consequentially, the rise of a mass upper middle class was in tandem with this decline of the white working class. Declines in marriage rates, the rise of secularism, the rise of a millennial generation, roughly people born around when I was born in 1970 and thereafter, that lacks experience with some of the Cold War issues that help solidify politics at a national level and create further divisions. And of course, the economy is one of the key elements of this argument, wherein the post-World War II economy in the mid-1940s and thereafter, we saw a relatively secure United States competing with a real rebuilding Europe, and the increase in material wealth from the 40s through the 60s, but then the consequential decline for a variety of reasons, obviously, in the 1970s, and the seesawing back and forth ever since the decline of the mid 70s. And so this has bounced back and forth economically, but in Teixeira's estimate, this is a materialistic society, and the economy is really important to understand voters' preferences. And so from his vantage point, he and Judas argued that with these trends, we were going to see an emergent majority that would favor the democratic politics of an active government that sought to support people in a variety of different ways, not just at the welfare state, but through a variety of different levers which could be implemented that would reallocate resources on a European style of satisfying a middle class that wanted certain types of government activity. And it would consequently see a reduction in economic and income inequality over time. And it would build up a series of programs that people would favor, maybe not necessarily progressive in the sense that we think of progressive today, but certainly much more activist government, standard, kind of a New Deal Democrat with a capital D approach to governance. And in some ways, the 2020 election may reify this. It may reflect it. The 2020 electorate with the pollsters was difficult to judge. And part of that was the experience that pollsters had back in 2016, when they found that they had not accurately accounted for the white working class and their voting preferences. This was the reason that Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan had a turn, although they were relatively close elections in terms of absolute numbers, they had a turn towards Trump. It was an assumption that this was part of the famous blue wall that would be a set of states that were pretty dependable for the presidential election for the Democratic candidate, no matter who they were. But nevertheless, there was this chink in this blue wall, and Clinton herself really didn't spend much time in 2016 in campaigning in these Midwestern states. And that arguably cost her the election. But even if she had spent time campaigning, the substance of her message would have been important. Obviously, you recall the problem with referring to Trump supporters as deplorables. And that was certainly not people necessarily in Appalachia, but nevertheless a swath of the population that could be found anywhere in the United States. And those were the people that used to be the blue collar, dependable voters for the Democratic Party. And the question, of course, that 2016 and 2020 raises is whether or not there has been a shift, maybe not permanent. There's nothing that's permanent necessarily in politics, but nevertheless, a long-term trend where the white working class, even though it's declining as a percentage of the population, it nevertheless is still an important electoral constituency, whether it's presidential elections or down ballot elections, congressional and even state and local. And so Teixeira and Judas's questions about the trends of demography, I think, still pertain today. Whether or not it means that there is an emergent Democratic majority, because of course, one of the big outcomes of this election is that progressivism in many ways is not necessarily on the ascendance. And that's another issue I want to mention, which is the question about, did progressivism really win? Certainly Joe Biden is in some ways a progressive, but in many ways he's considered within the Democratic Party to be something of a moderate. But if we look at races beyond the presidential race, it's interesting to note that progressivism is not necessarily winning. So I've got a little cheat sheet here that I want to note some of the results from California in particular. Now, of course, California is one of the most progressive states in the country in terms of the makeup of its legislature. The state assembly is the lower house, it's 80 seats. 60 of those are held by Democrats. The state Senate is the upper house. It's got 40 seats. 30 of those are held by Democrats. Many of them in both houses are progressive. Now, California, though, has the referendum system and the proposition system whereby voters get to vote on some of the most controversial public policy issues. And there were a lot of propositions in California this year. I want to highlight a few of them because it's interesting to note what the outcome was. So, for example, there was Proposition 15, which sought to raise property taxes on businesses. That lost. Proposition 16, famously the one that wanted to reinstate affirmative action in public employment, education, and contracting. That lost as well. The question of Proposition 18, whether 17-year-olds may vote, that one lost. Proposition 19, which was a property tax reduction, that one won. Proposition 21, which allowed cities to impose rent control, that lost dramatically, in fact. And it's notable because it was a large percentage losing effort. Proposition 22, this was one that sought to exempt Uber and Lyft, the ride-sharing services, from a law that would have classified the drivers as employees of Uber and Lyft rather than independent contractors. That one won, meaning they are exempt from that law, so they are not going to be considered employees, which is considered a defeat for the labor unions that wanted them to be considered as employees under the state law. Also, there was a protectionist measure for requiring on-site physicians at kidney dialysis centers, which was pushed by the Service Employees International Union. That one lost. There was an elimination of cash bail, Proposition 25. That lost as well. Now, that's a long list. My point in taking the time to reference it is, in the most progressive state in the Union, you would have thought some of these rather progressive ballot measures would have won, but all of them are defeated. And what does that say about the state? Again, this is a state, obviously, by its electoral outcomes in terms of representation, is overwhelmingly Democratic. And so it really brings up this question about what is it that's on the ballot? Is it essentially a reflection of personalities? Certainly Donald Trump is unique in this regard. He brings out more people, but what else is it that's bringing out the voters in a place that you would think would embrace certain types of policies and in fact rejects them wholesale? So this, again, is a long-standing question. Why is it that people vote? What is it that brings them out? And why do people abstain? But I think that certainly there are these anchors that bring people out, like the presidential election, but they're bringing out different types of people that embrace policies that are surprising in certain contexts, especially California being a notable example. So another question about demography being destiny. I know we're almost out of time when we start the question period soon. The trends that pollsters had seen back in 2020 and comparing the trends in 2016 to these, you see the breakdown demographically here. This is a BBC chart that, based on exit polls from both 2016 and 2020, we have this sense at this point for who was voting for whom. And you see here, excuse me, that the closest divisions at first appear to be within the white population, and then these are again self-identified as white. There's a big debate about why people pick one ethnic or racial identity over another. Some people might be classified as Hispanic or Asian actually classify themselves as white in certain contexts. So the numbers here might vary from poll to poll, but you see here that there's a big division within the white female population, Democrat versus Republican preferences, but also a historical dependability of Black males and females voting overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party, much closer when it comes to Hispanic divisions between Republicans and Democrats, and also closer in regard to Asians and so-called other ethnicities. So the concern that pollsters have had is whether or not their polls are accurately capturing who's voting and why, and or who's likely to vote. So let's take the Latino vote in 2020, for example. Biden claimed 66, almost 67% of that vote, Trump 32%. That's actually an increase from 2016. But what's important about this, again, this is going back to the destiny question about ethnicity. Latino eligible voters in terms of the general population, back in 2000, they were only 7%, but in 2020, they've increased to over 13%. And it's expected, of course, that they will continue to increase. But Latino is not a block that we can say is always going to vote in a predictable fashion. Location matters, the issues matter. So, for example, in Florida this year, the Cuban American vote was overwhelmingly in favor of Trump. 56% of the Cuban American vote goes for Trump. They make up, Latinos make up 19% of all Florida voters. So it's a substantial portion of the voting eligible population. But why do they go for Trump? The explanation, I think it's a good one, is that this is a primarily Cuban-oriented population that's concerned with the status of Cuba, has been for decades, traditionally favors the Republican Party and its stance ever since the Cold War on Cuba and American relations, American policy with it. But it's also concerned with the trend in the Democratic Party, relatively conservative group of Latino voters who are concerned with the Democratic Party becoming more progressive and having a so-called soft stance on things like Venezuela and the trends in Cuba and Venezuela, and the desire for what would be Democratic Party policy if the Democrats were recapture the White House. Would they reopen the United States in terms of tourism and travel and commerce with Cuba? How would that policy be implemented? That's part of the reason for the trend in Florida. Then you go over to California, and the Latino vote favors Biden very overwhelmingly, with 77% of the Latino vote going for him. They make up an even larger proportion of California voters at 34%. And so you really see here this large impact for Latinos. It will continue to grow. But again, it's not necessarily destiny for the Democratic Party, although I think it's definitely favorable in regard to recent issues and the way they're handled. But as you may be aware, the parties have their own internal divisions, and they will affect how it draws in different ethnic voters. So, for example, the Republicans, who are very much against the proposition in California that would reinstate affirmative action, found common cause with Asians in California, who were one of the most active ethnicities in organizing against that proposition. Asians overwhelmingly in California tend to vote for Democrats, but they found common cause with conservatives in trying to maintain the anti-affirmative action policies in the state. So as issues change over time, so too will parties, and that will draw in more voters of different ethnicities. So it's not necessarily that demographic trends today will inevitably continue into the future. So the other big point that I want to note before we open it up for questions is that the Senate results are really obviously going to be important, because Georgia's runoff elections are going to determine who controls the Senate, as you know. What's notable here, of course, is that the predictions prior to the election were that this could be at the state level, both national and at the state level within the states, that it could be a Democratic sweep. Not enough polls have been taken since November 3rd, so we don't really know. Even the people who are pollsters in Georgia haven't got a good sense of who is likely to be favored in either of these runoff elections. It's my suspicion that the relatively smooth and experienced Perdue for the Republicans will probably win over John Ossoff. Again, that's more of a gut sense than anything based on empirical evidence. And I think the race between Loeffler, the Republican, who was appointed only in January of this year by the Republican governor after the Republican senator had, Johnny Isakson had resigned. Loeffler is less well known within the state, less name recognition. And so in some ways she is competing as a challenger, not so much an incumbent, even though technically that's what she is, against Warnock. And so 1.4 million plus votes have already been cast, with early voting having opened up. And the total vote in Georgia back on November 3rd was over 4 million. So I anticipate that we could see the same level, which again is unusual because there's no presidential election to draw people out. But nevertheless, it's been well known within the state, of course, that this will really decide who controls the Senate and how the Democratic program of legislation will fare in Congress overall. Now, I should note that I want to skip ahead here to the state level races. The Democrats went into this election with 39 legislative chambers, 19 state houses, and 15 so-called trifectas, where the same party holds the governorship and both houses of the state government. The GOP had 59 legislative chambers, 29 state houses, and 21 trifectas. So they had an advantage. The Democrats had aimed to flip the legislatures in several states like North Carolina, my home state, Arizona, Texas, potentially, at least one chamber in Florida, Michigan, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Iowa. The Democratic Party lost in all of those venues. They failed to pick up any legislative chamber or any new governorship. There were several re-elections, but my point is, November 3rd was a defeat for the Republican president, but in many ways, it was really a victory for the rest of the party at all of its different levels. And so this question about how the electorate is shaping up may be closely correlated to demography, but I think personality really mattered here. In other words, if we had had a Republican president other than the man, Donald Trump, what would have been that president's incumbent's fortunes on November 3rd with the same record in terms of administration? Probably, I'm guessing, would have been a victory, because we really did have some ticket splitting where obviously Republican candidates and policies were supported throughout the country in maintaining a Republican advantage in these states, but also, of course, obviously gaining seats in the House at the national level, and at least so far, maintaining the Republican majority, slim one, albeit, in the Senate. So some of the key points here in regard to the courts, just a brief mention. This is a screenshot from the Supreme Court's order, essentially dismissing the state of Texas's motion to file a lawsuit in the court in an effort to overturn the results or the certified electors in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. It was essentially one state suing four other states, or hoping to do so. And this was a case of what's called original jurisdiction in the Supreme Court, which means the actual filing of the lawsuit would be, the trial would effectively be in the Supreme Court itself. And the court rejected it. It's not true that Alito and Thomas dissented. They only argued that they would have granted the petition to file a bill of complaint, meaning the initiation of the lawsuit, but not any other relief. I think they would have been joining the other nine in rejecting the case as what is essentially not non-justiciable, which means that they cannot entertain it as a court because the state of Texas simply did not have a interest at stake that would allow them what's called standing in the court, an ability to sue and have whatever injury they claim to be redressed by the court. In other words, this was essentially a frivolous suit from the court's standpoint, and it should effectively end the legal claims that the election could in some fashion be potentially overturned or altered by the action taken by the Supreme Court. In other words, this is not going to be a repeat of 2000. The court has essentially taken itself and the rest of the federal courts out of this question. I think that the latest lawsuits that have been filed by the Trump campaign or Trump individually, which was this past Sunday, are going to be fruitless. I think they'll probably be rejected by the courts. And so that's a lot to cover. And I realized I've used up my time. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and open the floor for questions.
Okay, thank you, Ian. As you all know, I think we use the blue hand protocol. You have to click the participants icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen so that the participants list appears. And at the bottom is a blue hand which you can click that if you want to ask a question. And the ground rules are that it really is questions and answers. So please do not try to make long statements, give minority views, rebuttals. Just ask questions, and Ian will answer them for us. So, Mike Martin, you're first, and I'm going to unmute you right now.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Ian, for an excellent presentation. I guess my question focuses on the Electoral College. There's certain states like Maine that have 1 vote and 2 votes here for the Electoral College in sections. Nebraska falls in the same bucket with, its electoral votes split. My question is, what is the origin of that split? And secondly, could other states kind of gravitate to essentially a congressional district by district electoral college vote, thereby aligning popular vote to the electoral vote as opposed to a winner collecting all votes? Do you understand the question?
I think I do. So the Maine and Nebraska are the only 2 states in the union that award their electoral votes based upon the results in each congressional district. The way they actually do it is that, just to backtrack a little bit to make sure we're all on the same page about how the electoral votes are made up, the number of electoral votes that each state has are a reflection of the number of representatives and the 2 senators that each state has. And so the way all 48 states, except for Maine and Nebraska, allocate their electoral votes is a winner-take-all allocation where all of the Republican electors or all of the Democratic electors are a reflection of who won the state based on majority vote within the confines of the state. The way Maine and Nebraska do it is that it's majority vote within each congressional district. So you can have a split where in one district, Trump could win, in another district, Biden could win. And also for the 2 senators, there are 2 votes that are essentially statewide, similar to the way it's decided in the other 48 states. It could be changed by each state if they wanted to model themselves after Maine and Nebraska. All the states could do that. Why do they not do it? It's a result of history, tradition, the sense of a straight slate seems to give a clear sense of a victory within the state. And I, in particular, think that it's fine for states, my personal opinion, I think it's fine for states to decide, because the Constitution allows them to do this, they can make up essentially any system of allocating electoral votes that they wish. They still have to allocate electoral votes under the Constitution, and so they can't essentially do away with the electoral votes. That would take a constitutional amendment. And interestingly enough, the Electoral College is that provision of the Constitution is the provision that has had the most formal efforts to be amended, whether through alteration or abolition, ever since the Constitution was established. And so it's the one that's been the target of the most constitutional amendments throughout our republic's history. There is, in fact, in January of this year, there was, or actually in January of 2019, there was a bill introduced by a representative from Tennessee to abolish the Electoral College and create a national popular vote through constitutional amendment. There is another effort to create a national popular vote, which is called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is a clunky title, but it's basically premised upon the ability of states under Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution to create what they're called compacts. They're like treaties between sovereign governments. And the Constitution allows compacts for a variety of reasons. And this effort is one to stay within nominally the Electoral College system by awarding electors, but instead members of the compact would agree that no matter who won the majority vote in their state, they would allocate their electors based on who won the national vote. So if a Republican would win the national popular vote, California's electors would have to go towards supporting the Republican rather than the Democrat who won in California. This has already been enacted in 15 states, plus the District of Columbia. They've got, they're more than halfway along to reaching the 270 electoral votes that are needed to win the presidency. So if we have a handful of additional states that join that compact, that will be a watershed in American politics, because you'll have a majority of the Electoral College votes where the states are, you have a majority of, not necessarily a majority number of states, but rather a majority of states holding Electoral College votes that are supporting a national popular vote, and that will probably be challenged in the courts. And I'm doubtful that the Interstate Compact would survive that challenge. But nevertheless, these are the efforts that the states can engage in to change how the electoral votes or the national popular vote is actually implemented for the presidential election. So I hope that answered your question.
Yes.
Thank you. Miguel.
Yeah, following up on the Electoral College before I get to my question, the basic problem with the Electoral College is that it gives too much land-based weight to the voting. So you have 4 states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, maybe Nebraska, 5 states. They have 10 senators, whereas California, with a lot of the population, has 2 senators. And then you get to an example like Puerto Rico, which has no senators. So there are 4 million people in Puerto Rico, more than those 5 states combined, but they don't get to vote for the president. So that's one issue, is to allow the Puerto Rico to become a state. The second is to reapportion the votes in the Electoral College so that they're all proportional to 1 man, 1 vote. Now, I am for the Electoral College. I don't think it should be disbanded. And I don't think this amendment, this law that they're trying to pass, is going to be helpful either. But it's a lot easier to throw 1 national election than 50 state elections. I think each state should have its own vote, but I think it should be proportional to population.
So Miguel, what is your question?
As far as the Puerto Rico goes, my original question was about the Hispanic population. You have a chart about Hispanics, but you mix them all together. It's like having the Asian or European chart. So do you have a chart that separates the Hispanic population by groups? I mean, the English have been fixated with the Spanish since Henry married Catherine of Aragon. So the Puerto Rican population votes one way, the Cuban population, I mean, most of the Watergate burglars were Cubans. So this is not new. They go back to Batista. They think they still want Batista back. So the Mexican population still thinks that 1/3 of the country should be theirs because we took it away from them in 1860. So you cannot group the population of Hispanics together.
Miguel, we have to let Ian answer the question.
Hispanic population by groups, like the Puerto Rican population compared to the Italians have more in common than, let's say, the Cubans.
Miguel, your time is up.
Okay, my question is, do you think it's possible to change the Electoral College so that it's proportional to one man, one vote?
Thank you.
Okay, so I share your concern with accurately identifying the voting preferences and policy preferences of these large ethnic groups that we unfortunately refer to as Latinos or Hispanics, because obviously, and that's part of what I wanted to get at with the chart that I showed for the Cuban population in Florida versus the Hispanic population in California, that they're not all of a piece and that you can subdivide based on gender, based on issues and national origin, et cetera. And so I fully agree with you that it's inartful and sometimes ill-informed way of understanding voting preferences if you only correlate it to these large ethnic identifications. In regard to changing the Electoral College to reflect a so-called one person, one vote approach, yes, it could be changed to an entirely proportional system. You could do that. It would have to be done through the constitutional amendment process or through the individual states deciding through these, they're on their own that they want to do it that way. Again, hasn't been, you could have a variety of different ways: ranked choice voting, proportional representation, allocate for electors, et cetera. States are free to do this. And so, yes, it is possible. I think it is unlikely because of the potential reduction in each state's impact, regardless of how big their congressional delegations are. So whether it's Wyoming or California, all states are often concerned about reducing what they see as their impact in the Electoral College when it comes to their impact on the presidential election. So this is one of the reasons I think so far that the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact hasn't been more appealing than it has been so far.
Thank you, Ian. Rich Jager.
You put up a slide showing the way the Supreme Court dealt with the Texas claim. Is there any indication there that the currently constituted Supreme Court may not be quite as right-leaning and conservative as we might have thought, especially after the latest appointment?
So in general, which this moves beyond what the court may or may not do in regard to election-related cases, but just the disposition of the justices, based on appointments, it's a 6-3 court, right? Republican appointed versus Democratic. But as famously has occurred throughout Supreme Court history, appointments are not always entirely reliable in their voting patterns. So the classic example for the current justices on the court is John Roberts. Roberts is largely interpreted as being a so-called institutionalist, meaning he wants to preserve the power of the court within, if you will, its lane, and not try to extend the court into disputes that are seen as being highly politically contentious, and thereby potentially reducing the court's actual import and impact as a judicial institution. So the best example of this, of course, the most famous one is the 2012 case, the so-called the Sebelius case, which was the Obamacare case, wherein they upheld the individual mandate utilizing it was a 5-4 decision with John Roberts being a swing vote. Roberts had sided with the 4 conservatives at the time in voting that the individual mandate could not be upheld under the Commerce Clause, which was rejecting a lot of jurisprudence that had existed ever since the 1930s, and embracing the ability of the individual mandate to be treated as a tax, which required Roberts to switch and vote with the 4 so-called liberals at the time. And so Roberts has never explained why he did this. I don't expect him to while he's on the court. Maybe he kept a diary. Maybe we'll see that after he's long gone. But this is interpreted as being Roberts' concern with the court extricating itself from a politically contentious issue like nationalizing or in some way redistributing healthcare resources like the Obamacare statute did. And conservatives didn't like it. Liberals did because of the result in that particular case. But from the vantage point of the so-called institutionalist, it is an effort to allow the majoritarian process to continue. In other words, if the majoritarian process enacted Obamacare, whether Roberts himself, and I suspect he disagrees with Obamacare, he is a conservative as far as I can tell, but that as a justice, he wanted to extricate the court as much as possible from it, thereby allowing the statute to succeed under some basis, even though it seemed like a stretch to a lot of conservative jurists or legal scholars. Nevertheless, that's one way to do it. And so the current court on certain issues, I think, is going to be clearly what conservatives have wanted, which is a pretty solid majority of 6-3 on things like, I suspect, for example, affirmative action. Roberts himself has said, if we want to end making judgments based on race, then we ought to end making judgments based on race. So pretty solidly against upholding affirmative action. I think with Barrett on the court, that would likely be a foregone conclusion. But again, Roberts has been reluctant to embrace state efforts to overturn access to abortion or reduce access to abortion. This would be the classic political issue that many would suspect that a right-leaning court would embrace. But Roberts, again, has been reluctant to continue what I think he sees as the politicization of the court by delving into these very hot button issues. So in this sense, I think it's uncertain whether there is a 6-3 solidly conservative court versus a 5-4 kind of case-by-case court. I think it may be the latter, depending on how salient the issue is.
Thank you. Richard, there's a guest named Richard. I don't know your last name. You're unmuted. You can speak. We can't hear you, Richard, if you're speaking. You have your blue hand up. Okay, so we'll move on to Jim Landwehr.
Hi, thanks for the interesting talk. Apart from 2000, has the Supreme Court ever had a major role in a federal election result, whether it be the race for president or a race for senator or representative in any of the states? So leaving aside 2000, what is the role that the Supreme Court has played in adjudicating election results?
So the court as an institution rarely adjudicates an election result in the sense of changing the winner. Certainly the jurisprudence of the court in regard to apportionment ever since the 1960s has been somewhat substantial. What we referred to earlier, that phrase, one man, one vote, or one person, one vote, that's a phrase from a series of cases in the 1960s that required electoral district drawing, which is electoral districts are redrawn roughly every decade. And that's based on the decennial census, which of course is occurring this year. And the redrawing standards ever since the Voting Rights Act of 1965 have been interpreted by the federal courts, Supreme Court and lower federal courts, in regard to how changes in districts are made, how allocations in regard to percentages of voters that can be in one district versus another, thereby deciding effectively who is in the district. In other words, what we refer to popularly as gerrymandering is something that has been effectively, I shouldn't say effectively, but has been veritably policed by the courts since the 60s. Prior to the 60s, rarely was the Supreme Court or any federal court dealing with a lot of election issues, not only in the sense of a particular election, but in the sense of implementing civil rights laws to protect, say, against discrimination regarding race-based discrimination on voting. Again, the Warren Court was famous for its decisions regarding things like the poll tax and literacy tests. And so these were efforts especially prominent in the South, or the old states of the Confederacy, that excluded effectively African Americans from voting, and had been the case ever since the 1870s with some of the black codes. But the efforts to deny people their civil rights have existed since the 1860s, and there have been the so-called 1983 actions, which is the name of a lawsuit that you can file under federal law if you claim a federal official or even a state official has violated your constitutional rights. Could be in relation to voting. Those have been allowed, but very few of them have actually gone all the way up to the Supreme Court and succeeded in terms of vindicating rights regarding voter treatment or discrimination. The court itself has really not decided any presidential election, although there were members of the court back in 1876, the famous Tilden v. Hayes election, wherein Samuel Tilden from New York had a slate of electors from some states that were contested. You basically had several states that sent different slates of electors, and the Congress and the court essentially decided they would make up this special, unique committee comprised partly of representatives and senators and justices from the Supreme Court to decide the election. And that's how 1876 election was decided. Very consequential election, of course, because it ultimately marked the end of Reconstruction. But nevertheless, that's not really the court, but rather members of the judiciary participating in the outcome of an election. But 2000 was unique because it was a particular case that actually helped decide the outcome of the presidential election because of the court's ruling in Bush v. Gore. But that's a really unusual one. And I can't think of anything near that in terms of an actual specific role that a federal court has taken.
Thank you, Ian. So at this point, it's 11:35 by my clock, and Ian has agreed to stick around a few more minutes if you want to continue. There's still 5 or 6 hands raised. Please keep your questions short at this point, and with no follow-ups. Okay. So the next person is Dave Oggins.
Hi. Yes. Very, very good speech. I enjoyed it very much. My quick question is, I saw your chart on white men and white women easily voting for Trump. What about education? Is there any chart that shows that education voters vote one way or the other, especially with the white people?
Absolutely. I don't know of a good one from 2020 yet, but certainly from 2016, we do have data that suggested that less educated whites, that would be, there are different ways to construe less educated, but essentially it is a line wherein the rule of thumb is essentially in the white population, again, in self-identified white population, the greater the educational attainment level, the more likely they are associated with Democratic Party voting trends. Less educated whites in greater numbers are voting for Republicans, and that was noticeable in the 2016 election. And so, yes, there is an educational divide. Again, there are plenty of PhDs who vote for Trump, and there are plenty of people without a high school diploma who have voted for Biden. But nevertheless, if you look at it as a demographic division based on educational attainment, there are these trends. And one of the consequential concerns is, do pollsters accurately reflect this in their polling? And even, especially in 2016, it was the American Association, I've forgotten the technical title of them, but it's basically a polling organization for the industry. urged pollsters, large and small, to make sure that they adjusted for less educated whites. And part of the problem was a perception that there's the so-called Bradley effect in polling. Tom Bradley, back in 1982, was the mayor of Los Angeles who was running for governor in California. Pre-election polls that year had him leading consistently. All the polls had him leading consistently, but he lost, clearly lost, not by a small margin, in the actual gubernatorial election. And the question was, why would all the pre-election polls suggest Bradley had been in the lead, and then all of a sudden he loses on election day? Nothing, no October surprise, nothing happened that all of a sudden turned the electorate against him. And the so-called Bradley effect, and this has been known by different names, it's the so-called socially distanced or the shy voter effect, which is there are certain candidates that are perceived by voters as not being preferred in general. Trump obviously would be one of these. In other words, controversial candidate, and that the shy voter effect means that when a poll is taken in a voter who favors candidate A is asked whether they favor A, they say, no, they don't, but they're lying. And in fact, they do. And so this is one of the problems with polling in regard to Trump is there is a concern among some pollsters that you might have the shy voter effect in regard to questions about Trump. And that's why even in 2020, some of the turnout was dramatically different. Not enough to throw the election for Trump, but nevertheless, not nearly as much of a runaway for Biden as had been anticipated within some of these state polls.
Thank you, Ian. So at this point, we're going back to Richard, who has a blue hand raised. Please say your whole name and then ask your question. Richard, we're not hearing you, so we have to move on. So Bapi Sen, you're up.
Very interesting presentation. My question is, the current census that is going on, the effect of that census on the electoral process, like, is it going to be that New York will lose some number and Arizona, Texas might gain some? Is that effect happening?
I apologize. I'm not entirely certain I understand the question. Are you asking whether or not the method of taking the census is having an impact?
Sorry, I just he got muted because I thought he was finished.
Oh, okay.
Bapi, if you can unmute, you can clarify your question. Okay.
Is the actual census that's going on right now?
Yes.
Will New York will lose some and Texas will gain some? Is that happens?
Okay. I'm not entirely certain I understand the question, but I'll note this in regard to the census. Recently, in fact, in December, just a few days ago, the Supreme Court had made what's kind of a tentative ruling on the Trump administration's effort to exclude undocumented immigrants from the census for purposes of reapportionment. In other words, they would be counted in terms of being residents of different states in order to have the demographic information, but that in terms of a reapportionment, there was this effectively an executive order, which I don't know if it was technically an executive order, but the count would exclude these undocumented immigrants. And there is a substantial debate about whether that is a constitutional action on the part of the administration. Can undocumented immigrants be excluded from the count? But beyond that, I don't have much information about how successful the census is this year. Certainly, one of the big consequences from this election will be that there are Republican controlled states that will be controlling redistricting over the next couple of years based on the 2020 census results. And certainly there are always legal challenges to redrawn districts. And I'm sure there will be in 2022, 2024, but nevertheless, there are many Republicans state legislatures that will be in command of the redistricting process. Only about 19 states, if I recall correctly, actually use commissions that redraw the districts. The rest of them use the regular legislature to redraw it. And of course, that matters in regard to who's in command of the legislature. So I apologize if I didn't answer your question.
Okay, so we're really running out of time.
I didn't fully understand it.
So Clarence Modeste, you get the last word.
Thank you for your timely and very interesting topic. You mentioned that the Electoral College, I'm getting back to that, that in reference to the Electoral College, that this subject has come up over time, several times or many times. Could you tell us over time how it has panned out relative to changing the Constitution, a constitutional amendment, in order to get rid of the Electoral College and have a more democratic system with the popular vote?
Well, that's an easy one to answer because there's essentially been no change. The states are allowed under the Constitution to decide how they will decide who their electors are. But in terms of the system of the Electoral College, the special system for selecting the president, that hasn't changed since the Constitution was ratified. And so all of these efforts have failed, whether they've been at the national level for a constitutional amendment. Again, this national popular vote, this interstate compact route is unique. It's on its way. I think that it may eventually reach that 270 threshold and then attempt to be implemented, but I think it'll be challenged in the courts. I should note, myself, my own 2 cents, I'm a big fan of the Electoral College. I actually like it. I think it does a lot of things that moderate the politics within the country. I like the 2-party system, even though it was not designed with that in mind. I think it actually helps support it. And it helps moderate the political positions that presidents take. And I think we do have a national popular vote. It's just on a state-by-state basis. So within each state, there is a majoritarian process of a popular vote. And I understand why a national popular vote system would appeal to people's sense of fairness and democracy with a small d. But I think we still achieve that under the current Electoral College system. Again, that's just my 2 cents on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. So
Thank you.
at this point, we hand it back to Marv Pincus to wrap things up.
Thanks a lot. Very informative and educational talk. And we have generally 2 ways to thank our speakers. The first is by presenting the speaker with a certificate of appreciation, which I think Paul just screened. As you can see, there's an emblem of an orchid there. This is our 90th year anniversary. The Old Guard was formed in 1930 when the orchid was the Summit was the orchid capital of the East Coast. And so we are delighted to present you with that certificate. In addition, our second way of thanking you is if it was in person with a rousing applause, but we can't do it now. So perhaps we can, if we show that, we can all applaud on the tiles.
Hooray! Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much for your lecture today.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed presenting it, and I hope it was helpful and informative.